The first man to be granted the title the Great was indeed not Alexander, but the King of Kings, Cyrus II of Persia, founder of the first superpower in human history. The regions from Asia Minor to Mesopotamia and then to Egypt in the south had seen some of the earliest great civilizations of humankind. The first ever recorded war was fought between two Mesopotamian regional powers in 2700 BC, the Elamites and the Sumerians. The first written language, Sumerian, and the first empire, the Achaemenid Empire, all originated from the lands in which the Persians would eventually rule for hundreds of years. Cyrus was born around 600 BC as a member of the Achaemenid royal family. At that time, Cyrus's grandfather, Astyages, ruled over the Median Empire in what is now western and northern Iran and parts of eastern Anatolia. According to the ancient historian Herodotus, Astyages had a troubling dream about his grandson Cyrus overthrowing him. In response, he allegedly ordered the baby Cyrus to be killed. However, the official tasked with killing him spared the child, and Cyrus was raised in secret. According to legend, a mere child's game led to the discovery of Cyrus, who had harmed the son of a Persian noble. After discovering that his grandson was still alive, Astyages surprisingly spared Cyrus's life and allowed him to live with his biological family, who were ruling over the region of Anshan as vassal kings. Cyrus became king of Anshan around 559 BC, after his father, Cambyses I, passed away. Cyrus was a competent, strong, and just leader who seemed like a good alternative as King of Kings, compared to his rather cruel grandfather. Astyages, who had ordered the killing of his own blood as a result of a mere dream, had also made Cyrus's savior, Harpagus, unwittingly eat his own son as punishment for denying the king's orders. This is where Cyrus's trademark began to shine. He was always seen as a liberator, not as a conqueror. So when he began to revolt against his grandfather in 552 BC, he received significant support from the Median aristocracy. Cyrus was able to demonstrate his military skills by winning a series of victories, culminating in the Battle of Pasargadae, where he managed to defeat a superior Median force, ultimately winning him the war. Cyrus did not seek vengeance and spared his grandfather's life. He seized the Median capital of Ecbatana, keeping its walls and status intact, and gave Median noblemen high positions in his new Achaemenid Empire. He was no saint, though, and had Astyages' offspring, his cousins, killed to reduce future threats. It's no wonder that Alexander the Great greatly admired Cyrus. As king of the Achaemenid Empire, Cyrus the Great understood that to unite his realm, he had to unite its people. Medes and Persians had to coexist to secure a stable empire. The Achaemenid Empire was divided into satrapies, each overseen by a satrap, which allowed for better local governance and tax collection. The king himself, along with most Persians at that time, followed the teachings of Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest monotheistic religions. Under Cyrus the Great, there was tolerance for every religion. The Jews, for example, called Cyrus a prophet, as he allowed them to return to their homeland after the Babylonian exile, just as a prophecy in the Bible stated. The king of Lydia, Croesus, saw Cyrus as an usurper of the Median throne. Ready for war, the king of Lydia asked the oracle of Delphi for guidance. The oracle responded, "If Croesus goes to war, he will destroy a great empire." As always in ancient sources, the oracle was perfectly right, just not as Croesus had imagined. Buoyed by the divine message, Croesus led a huge army across the Halys River and attacked the Persians in 547 BC. The Lydian war efforts were supported by Ionian Greeks, a fact the Persians would not forget within the coming 100 years. Cyrus's camels, war chariots, and disciplined infantry overran the Lydian army at the Battle of Thymbra. Croesus hoped that winter would end hostilities, but the Achaemenid king pushed on and laid siege to the capital of Lydia, Sardis, taking it within a fortnight. Cyrus knew that Croesus was a seasoned statesman, so he spared his life, and the former Lydian king became a loyal advisor while Anatolia was annexed. The Achaemenid Empire grew, and so did its military. An elite regiment was formed, the Immortals, who constantly consisted of 10,000 men, as dying or wounded men were immediately replaced. Cyrus the Great now laid his eyes on the last major power in Western Asia, the Babylonian Empire. King Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king, had previously grown increasingly unpopular among his people. He sought to replace the worship of Babylon's chief deity, Marduk, with the unpopular moon god Sin. Cyrus had learned of this change and wanted to act as a liberator, promising the Babylonians to reinstate their traditions. In early autumn of 539 BC, the Persian army crushed the Babylonian armed forces in and around Opis at the Tigris River. Little is known about this engagement, but for the first time, the Persian army was estimated to be larger than their opponents. The Babylonians were seemingly ill-prepared for a proper defense, and many important cities, such as Sippar, fell before the city of Babylon itself was taken. The wealthy Babylon had been protected by strong walls and the Euphrates River, which flowed through the city. Cyrus's army diverted the course of the Euphrates. By lowering the water level of the river, Persian troops could enter the city through the riverbed, bypassing Babylon's fortified walls. Shortly after the conquest, Cyrus issued the Cyrus Cylinder, a proclamation that emphasized his role as a just and chosen ruler by Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. He claimed to have restored peace and stability, freed captives, and allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands. For some, Cyrus the Great seemed like the ideal ruler. He not only conquered vast lands, but also maintained their unity. However, even the likes of him are not protected from an undeserved ending. Around 530 BC, during one of his campaigns against the Massage-Te, a nomadic tribe in Central Asia, Cyrus was killed in battle. According to ancient sources, Cyrus died while fighting Queen Tomyris of the Massage-Te. Herodotus describes a gruesome account of his death, where Tomyris is said to have put his severed head in a wineskin filled with blood, as revenge for the death of her son in battle. Ironically and tragically, a man who never sought vengeance ended up getting killed for vengeance. Cyrus the Great had 6 children with the love of his life, Cassandane. His successor would be his firstborn son, Cambyses, who would go on to conquer Egypt but would have a mixed record of ruling. His successor in turn would be Darius I, who expanded Persian borders to their greatest extent and brought prosperity. After the cruel death of Cyrus the Great in 530 BC, his eldest son Cambyses II became king of the Persian Empire. Cambyses, named after his grandfather, was ruling over Babylon when news of his father's death reached him. Information about the king's personality is quite sparse, and most of what we know comes from Herodotus and Egyptian sources, both of which are biased and very critical of him. However, Cambyses II's reign would be marked by military conquests, sandstorms that devoured entire armies, and a magician who took control of the empire, after which Persia would reach its golden age under Darius I. The Babylonians were very superstitious, so when a famine struck their homeland in the years following Cambyses' ascension, the people likely began to whisper that their new Achaemenid lord and king was unworthy. Herodotus even claims that the king killed his younger brother Smerdis out of fear for his position. Nevertheless, in 525 BC, Cambyses II assembled an army and a fleet to conquer the last great civilization within the Persian sphere of influence, ancient Egypt. Pharaoh Amasis II had previously cheated the Persian king out of his daughter's hand. But now that the pharaoh was dead and his inexperienced son had ascended the throne, the time to strike had come. Like his father before him, King Cambyses II used all elements before even meeting the opponent in battle. A Greek general within the Egyptian army provided valuable information, while the Arabs supplied the Persian army with enough water to cross the Sinai Desert. When the battle finally began at Pelusium in the Nile Delta, the Achaemenid forces used a clever strategy. The Egyptians worshipped animals like cats, especially the cat goddess Bastet. Aware of this, the Persian army placed real cats in front of their soldiers, effectively preventing the Egyptians from attacking them. According to legend, this tactic worked to some extent, and the Egyptian army was decisively defeated, with over 50,000 casualties on the pharaoh's side. What remained of the Egyptian army fled to Memphis, which would soon be besieged and captured. The Old Kingdom had fallen, and the Persian Achaemenid Empire had expanded further. King Cambyses II was crowned pharaoh and followed a key practice of his father by allowing Egyptian high officials to serve under the new government, respecting religious traditions, even though Herodotus claims that the Persians killed the sacred Apis bull, believed to be an incarnation of the god Ptah. Further expeditions to Ethiopia and Carthage were planned, but an entire Persian army, 50,000 soldiers, was lost in the Libyan desert. To this day, it's unclear what exactly happened, but the Persians claimed that the army was swallowed by a gigantic sandstorm, burying all men in the desert. Another theory suggests that the army was ambushed and routed by local rebels, and the Persians sought to cover up their losses. Regardless of the true cause, bad news for Cambyses II continued as a revolt broke out in the Persian homeland. A magician named Gaumata had claimed to be Smerdis, the younger son of Cyrus the Great, the brother Cambyses allegedly killed. The king attempted to rush back as quickly as possible, but he never made it home, dying in Syria under mysterious circumstances. Gaumata was a member of the Magi priestly caste. In Greek, they were called magoi, or magicians. According to Herodotus, he used magic to disguise himself as Smerdis and even deceived the dead prince's widow. Gaumata's reign as King of Kings was very short-lived, though as in September of 522 BC, another conspiracy took place. In Pasargadae, one of Persia's cultural centers, a group of 7 Achaemenid nobles assassinated Gaumata. One of the conspirators would become particularly important now. Darius I, a distant relative of both Cyrus the Great and his son, whom he had served as a lance-bearer during the Egyptian campaign, was chosen as the new king of Persia. His rise to power was remarkably swift, and one could wonder if it hadn't been planned from the start. The Behistun inscription is a massive multilingual relief and text carved into a cliffside, ordered by Darius I and written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. It mostly covers the events I just described, providing Darius' version of how he rose to power. However, modern historians find it difficult to believe that Gaumata deceived an empire, including Smerdis's widow, into thinking he was the real prince. After all, there was no mention of magic in Darius's story, and only Herodotus told us about sorcery. It seems more likely that Herodotus might have been mistaken about Cambyses II killing his younger brother. In fact, it could have been the real Smerdis, who was still alive, who eventually claimed the throne and was removed by Darius, who later invented a different story about a magician to legitimize his actions. King Darius I would go on to rule for the next 36 years, making the Achaemenid Empire reach its peak. At the same time, Persian infrastructure was completely reshaped, and many of Cyrus the Great's administrative visions were fully realized. Much like Emperor Augustus, Darius I turned bricks into marble. In 518 BC, the Indus Valley fell to the Persian Empire and became the 20th satrapy, one of many that paid an annual tribute. The royal road, stretching from Sardis to Susa, ensured quick communication and travel throughout the empire. Messages were even sent by having the men with the loudest voices shout information to the nearest outpost, and the message would continue its journey until it reached its destination. The king of Persia was the most powerful man alive at that time, and his eyes now turned to the west, onto Europe. Along the Black Sea, European Scythia was an excellent geopolitical point for planning further conquests into Greece. After all, the Persians had not forgotten that the Ionian Greeks had supported the Lydians against Persia a few decades earlier. However, the Scythians employed an efficient, scorched earth tactic, forcing the imperial army to retreat. Nevertheless, the Persians were still keen to increase their influence in the region, and from 499 BC onward, the first Greco-Persian conflicts began. The decisive battle occurred at Marathon on September 10th, 490 BC. Some 10,000 Athenians, mostly hoplites, faced a Persian force nearly 10 times their size. A pattern began to emerge that would prove problematic for the Persians in the future. The Greeks, defying the rules of war, achieved a decisive victory. By the end of the day, fewer than 200 Athenians had fallen, while 6,000 Persian soldiers lay dead. After the battle, a Greek messenger ran from Marathon to Athens, precisely 42 kilometers, to proclaim victory before dying from exhaustion. Darius I would die from illness 4 years later. His reign is remembered as the golden age of the Achaemenid Empire, despite the setback in Greece. His successors, however, would not forget this humiliation and would look for an opportunity to strike again. Most of the history of the Persian Empire is relatively unknown to Western civilization. The Greco-Persian conflicts and the conquests of Alexander the Great are often the only studied fields of interest. On this channel, I have already covered the very beginning of the first superpower in human history, with King Cyrus and later Darius the Great. We are now in the year 486 BC, and Xerxes, the eldest son of Darius and Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, inherited all lands from the Indus Valley to Macedonia. The Persian Empire at this time was perfectly structured and organized, with a military force greater than any other on the planet. Rivaling the status his father possessed was not easy for Xerxes, but there was one task in which he had a chance to surpass him, something Darius had failed to do at Marathon: to subdue the Greek states. The planned invasion of Greece was postponed for the time being. Before moving forward, Xerxes first had to quell rebellions in Egypt, then in Babylon. The king, it appears, was at best lacking in the grace and wisdom of his forebears. He invaded the Nile Delta and, even more insultingly, melted down the statue of Marduk revered by the Babylonians. This was an especially grievous affront to Babylonian dignity and tradition, as one of a ruler's religious duties was to grasp Marduk's hands during the New Year's festival to ensure continued success and prosperity throughout the lands. Whereas his father and grandfather declared themselves emperors of the whole Persian Empire, Xerxes considered himself only king of the Persians and the Medes. At the same time, men from all corners of the empire were being rounded up, and arms were being manufactured in an attempt to construct the most formidable landing force in the history of mankind. According to Herodotus, Xerxes left Sardis with over 2 million soldiers and 4,000 ships, but even more realistic counts used by many scholars estimate an army of 360,000, supported by a navy of 750 ships. Xerxes was not as barbaric and arrogant as he is commonly portrayed. His plan for conquest was well thought out and planned. In order to move his army and supplies safely across to Europe, he had hundreds of ships moored side by side, each with 2 bridges built, connected with ropes and wooden planks, and a covering of earth on top to give a smooth, solid crossing. The first bridge soon collapsed in a large storm, and Xerxes became furious as the loss of these ships was important to his plans. In fact, he reportedly ordered that the sea be punished by lashes and red-hot iron chains, according to Herodotus, who stated that the engineers responsible were also executed. Ultimately, a new, more stable construction was erected with better support against wind and currents. The now king of the Persians and Medes watched as his huge army crossed the bridges, taking 7 days. 30 independent Greek states formed a congress. Their rivalries were laid aside to defend their homeland as a union. Sparta was given high command on land, while their Athenian brothers guarded the sea. The sea battle of Artemisium and the land battle of Thermopylae were fought simultaneously. The Greeks were hopelessly outnumbered in both fights, but made the Persians pay for every meter of land. In the end, the Persians ultimately won the terrains at a very high cost. However, the sacrifices of Spartan hoplites and Greek ships slowed down the Persian advance significantly, and the Allied contingents were not virtually destroyed. The outcome at Thermopylae resulted in the entirety of Boeotia falling to Xerxes. Attica was also left open. The remnant population of Athens was removed, with help from the remaining Allied fleet, to Salamis. The Peloponnesian allies then commenced to create a defensive line across the Isthmus of Corinth with a wall, and by demolishing the roadway from Megara, as they abandoned Athens to the Persians. Thus, Athens fell to the Persians, and the scant Athenian survivors who had barricaded themselves on the Acropolis were ultimately defeated. After this, Xerxes commanded the destruction of the ancient city, something the Greeks would never forget nor forgive. The tide of this conflict would turn at Salamis, where most of the Greek resistance was organized. All of Xerxes' advisors, except Artemisia of Halicarnassus, urged the king to attack. Artemisia made the argument that the Greeks would surrender without further fighting, as their provisions and supplies would eventually crumble. Xerxes, however, ultimately ordered the fleet to engage the Greek navy at the island of Salamis, and the first greatly recorded naval battle in history occurred. The Greek fleet could only muster less than 400 triremes, while the Achaemenid Empire commanded twice as many. The Athenian commander Themistocles lured the enemy into narrow waters. The Persians sought to block the entry to free waters, but in their attempt, hindered their own movement and strength. Seeing this, the Greco alliance took the initiative and both rammed and boarded as many enemy vessels as possible. It was a disaster for Xerxes, as 300 of his ships were lost. With sea superiority lost, the possibility that the Greeks would now destroy the bridges on which the Persians marched across earlier in spring became real. The King of Kings decided to return home with parts of the army, as many soldiers contracted dysentery due to a lack of food. Back home, Xerxes I planned great infrastructural projects. He sought to even surpass his father in this regard. It's very likely that monumental buildings were intended to distract from the failure in Greece. The state treasury was therefore further drained, and it became clear that the golden age of the Achaemenid Empire had reached its end. In late summer of the following year, the deciding Battle of Plataea was yet another setback for Persian territorial expansion. The remaining royal army was destroyed, and most of its high command killed by the largest Greek army ever assembled. All Persian ambitions to control all of Greece were virtually destroyed forever, and the Greeks now thought of themselves as superior. They even conducted counteroffensives in the following year. It's fair to say that Xerxes was probably the weakest Persian king until this point, and his final years didn't do much to redeem him. Xerxes I ruled until 465 BC, when he was assassinated in a conspiracy by his subordinate Artabanus, who also killed the king's heir, Darius. Xerxes' third-born son managed to claim the throne and became Artaxerxes I. When Xerxes I was assassinated in 465 BCE, the Persian Empire was still vast, stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. But beneath the surface, the cracks were beginning to show. In my previous videos, you've seen Cyrus the Great's vision, as well as Darius the Great's superb administration. You've seen the beginning of the decline under Xerxes, overstretched borders, costly wars, and rebellion simmering across provinces. Now, we look at what followed. The slow unraveling of the empire, ending in its fall at the hands of a young Macedonian king. Artaxerxes I inherited an empire riddled with revolt. Egypt rose in rebellion, and even in the heartland, loyalty was thinning. The central authority weakened. Satraps, governors meant to serve the king, began acting like kings themselves. Parallels to Cyrus's early challenges are clear, but unlike Cyrus, his successors lacked the charisma or military prowess to reunify the realm. During this chaos, Persia's old enemies, the Greeks, re-emerged. Artaxerxes and his successors poured gold into Greek politics, funding Sparta one decade, Athens the next. The rebellion of Cyrus the Younger against his brother Artaxerxes II in 401 BCE, ironically, named after the empire's founder, underscored the decay. It took Greek mercenaries to nearly tip the balance. The Persian throne won, but barely. The Anabasis of Xenophon tells us just how chaotic the aftermath was. Xenophon, an Athenian soldier and writer, was part of the 10,000, a Greek mercenary force hired by Cyrus the Younger. After the former was killed at the Battle of Cunaxa, the Greeks were stranded deep in Persian territory, thousands of miles from home. Leaderless, surrounded by enemies and betrayed by the Persians, they had to fight their way north to reach the safety of the Black Sea. Under Artaxerxes III, the empire briefly showed signs of revival. Egypt was reconquered. Order, for a moment, returned. But it came at a cost: purges, assassinations, and brutal repression. Even the royal family wasn't safe. When Artaxerxes III was poisoned by his own courtier Bagoas, the final chapter had begun. His successor, Arses, was a puppet. Then came Darius III, installed by the same puppet master. But Darius too was weak. Not just in leadership, but in legitimacy. He was in fact just a minor noble. The empire he inherited was Persian in name, but fractured in loyalty. A 21-year-old Alexander crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE. Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, each battle exposed how far the once mighty empire had fallen. Local governors failed to cooperate. The king fled more than he fought. By 330 BCE, the last king of Persia, Darius was dead, betrayed by his own satrap. The cohesion of Cyrus, was finally gone. Interestingly, Alexander the Great was himself a big fan of Cyrus I. It is known that the Macedonian in general admired Persian tradition, infrastructure, and administration. So when Alexander walked into Persepolis in triumph and effectively ended the Persian Achaemenid Empire, we can at least say that it impacted the world long after its fall as a vision of unity with foreign nations and respect for diverse traditions. The dream of Persia survived long after its fall.
What we do in life echoes in eternity.